At dinner, my son laughed in front of everyone and said, "You wouldn't get it, Dad. You're too old to understand tech." He didn't whisper it. He said it loud enough for the whole room to hear. It wasn't anger in his voice. That would have hurt less. It was casual, dismissive, like he was brushing lint off his suit. His colleagues chuckled, some politely, some openly. My grandson looked down, embarrassed. My daughter-in-law reached for the wine as if that would erase the awkward silence. But he didn't stop there. "You're from a different world? Now it's about apps, data, scale. It's not about tinkering in garages or scribbling in notebooks anymore." And just like that, years of my life, late nights, soldering boards, patent filings, the first prototype that booted on a garage floor in '94, were reduced to a joke. I didn't respond, not because I had nothing to say, but because I suddenly saw the wall between us wasn't new. He had been building it, brick by brick, for years. The worst part? I had helped him build his side of that wall, helped him with seed money, helped him find his first investor, gave him my notebook, my designs, thinking it was a gift, a legacy. But now I was just too old to understand. That night, when they toasted to next-gen innovation, and someone raised a glass to my son as a visionary, I realized I was not part of the story anymore. I was the footnote, and sometimes a footnote needs to remind the page who wrote it. Friends, let me pause for just a second. Please tell me in the comments, where are you watching this from? Has something like this ever happened to you or someone you love? Your stories help us grow this channel together. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if this resonates with you. Now, let's continue. Friends, let me take a short pause. Would you mind sharing in the comments? Where are you listening to this story from? Have you ever been in a situation like this, where someone close dismissed your worth or forgot what you've built? If this story speaks to you, please consider liking this video, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. It truly helps us grow this channel and bring more voices to light. Now, let's continue. He watched the live stream from the small study where he once sketched circuit diagrams and scribbled algorithmic ideas on napkins. On the screen, his son stood before a sea of eager faces, angel investors, journalists, tech bloggers, heralding the next big thing in data analytics. The son spoke fluidly about our breakthrough and redefining user experience, punctuating each point with confident hand gestures. But nowhere did he say, "This was inspired by conversations with my father," or "credit to the man who taught me to think in algorithms." They treated the origin story like a myth, clean, marketable, devoid of real names and faces. The company's website boasted a founder's vision, illustrated with sleek graphics and glowing testimonials. No mention of the workshop down the hall. No reference to nights when the father had kept the fluorescent lamp burning past midnight, showing his son how to solder circuit boards and debug code line by line. He remembered sitting at that same desk years ago, explaining the potential of pattern recognition long before machine learning was a buzzword. His son had listened wide-eyed, asking questions that seemed new at the time. Later, the father had sealed those notes in a dated folder, proof that the seed was planted long before investors cared. Now the father sat alone, heart tightening with each polished pitch and buzzword that rolled off his son's tongue as if conjured from thin air. The world had embraced those ideas, celebrated their novelty, and he, once the wellspring of those concepts, had become the forgotten architect of success. Behind the screen he rose and walked to the window, watching the twilight settle. In the office beyond, he had built foundations, both technical and personal. But the narrative had been rewritten, and in that rewrite, his own place had vanished. He felt a familiar ache, the ache of watching your legacy be packaged and sold, while your name drifts away like dust in the corners. Yet, beneath that ache, something else stirred, something resolute. Because a man's true ownership isn't defined by marketing copy. It's defined by proof, and only a court of law or the judge's gavel could restore what memory had erased. He turned from the window, eyes steeled. The startup celebration echoed faintly through the walls, but he no longer needed their applause. He had the evidence waiting: sketches, dated patents, letters to himself in triple-sealed envelopes. The truth was old, but unshakable, and it was time to remind the world who had first lit the spark. He hadn't spoken of it for years, not out of secrecy, but humility. Those evenings in the garage when he'd explain the beauty of recursive systems, or sketch out how user prediction models might learn over time, he believed, perhaps naively, that some things were shared not for credit, but for connection. He thought his son was listening as a student. He didn't expect him to walk away as a thief. The papers sat where he always kept them, in an old leather folder slightly worn on the edges, tucked inside the bottom drawer of his desk. It wasn't locked. He never felt the need. He had long believed that love, like trust, didn't need safeguards. But that folder, it held more than notes. It held time, vision, and the invisible labor of a mind decades ahead of its moment. He sat down slowly and opened it, the leather creaking with memory. Inside, the original patent filing for a modular neural processing system. Next to it, a printed email he had sent to himself years ago, outlining an adaptive logic tree for user forecasting, complete with a timestamp. Further down, hand-drawn schematics on yellowing graph paper, annotated in the margins with small observations like test recursive weights and possible pivot, behavioral indexing, and then tucked inside a plastic sleeve, the most important document of all, a signed non-disclosure agreement. Not with a corporation, not from an investor, just a simple form, drawn up when his son was 19 and asked to help with some coding practice. They'd laughed about it at the time. "Dad, why so formal?" the boy had said. And he'd replied, "One day you'll understand the value of ideas." The signature was there, in his son's handwriting. He stared at it for a long while. It wasn't vengeance that stirred in him. It was a deep, grieving ache. The kind that arrives when you realize someone you raised learned all the brilliance of your mind, but forgot the dignity of your heart. His son hadn't stolen just ideas. He had erased a name. The startup's valuation was growing by the hour. Articles were already appearing. Young genius reinvents predictive tech. The irony wasn't lost on him. Genius isn't always in the invention. Sometimes it's in planting the first seed and trusting the roots to hold. His son had used those roots and then cut the tree. But now he wasn't just a father. He was the legal inventor. The papers proved it. And when the judge would read those patents aloud, as he inevitably would, the room would remember what the family had forgotten. That wisdom doesn't age, it just waits. The lights dimmed, the projector hummed to life, and his son stepped forward with the confidence of a man who thought he owned the future. The room was sleek, modern, all glass, metal, and curated ambition. Rows of suits lined the table, each one representing a fund, a bet, a belief in the next big thing. And there, just beyond the last row, almost blending into the wall, sat the man they didn't see coming. He wore no badge, no title. No one introduced him. He wasn't invited, but no one questioned his presence either. A quiet older man in a charcoal coat, sitting with his hands folded, his expression unreadable. It was how he had always entered rooms, unnoticed until it mattered. The presentation began. "Ladies and gentlemen," his son said, smiling like he had already won, "what we've created is not just technology. It's transformation. A predictive system that adapts in real time, built from the ground up by our brilliant team." A click. The first slide appeared. Bold charts, polished models, corporate polish dressed in faux humility. Another click. Buzzwords. Another. Projections. Another. And then, "This," the son continued, "is entirely our original design. No outside influence, no licensing, no legacy tech. We built this." The room nodded. Except for 3 investors, they didn't nod, because they were staring past the glow of the screen, past the polish of the pitch, toward the man in the back. He didn't flinch, didn't move, just looked calmly, almost sadly, as if watching someone dig a hole they didn't know was a grave. He had come not to interrupt, not yet. He came to watch, to give them the chance to be honest, to remember, to say even once, this was inspired by work that came before, work done by those who gave us everything. But it never came. Slide after slide, claim after claim, as if he and everything he had poured into those early sketches, those long nights in the garage, those dreams whispered over dinner, had never existed. One of the investors leaned to the side, whispering to a colleague. Another tapped on his phone. The third was already pulling up something on a tablet. The old man knew that look. He'd worn it once himself, long ago. The moment you realize the person pitching you isn't just stretching the truth. They're standing on someone else's shoulders and pretending they built the ground. He remained still, but inside something shifted. Not out of anger, not out of vengeance, but clarity. This wasn't just about being forgotten. This was about being erased. And some erasures leave fingerprints. They met outside, behind the glass building that shimmered like pride. The father had waited, not to accuse, not to shame, just to ask, just to talk, the way fathers and sons used to. His son was checking his phone, distracted. The pitch had gone well, mostly. A few questions had been raised, but nothing he couldn't smooth over. He barely looked up when the older man approached. "You should have told them," the father said quietly. No judgment in his voice, just the soft exhaustion of someone who had carried too much for too long. The son exhaled sharply, annoyed. Told them what? That some of those ideas came from kitchen table napkins 30 years ago? They weren't napkins. They were patents, the father replied, still calm. Registered, filed, protected, and shared. With you. The son finally looked at him. "Dad, come on. What is this? You want a cut? A share?" Some round of applause. The father blinked, once, then twice. "I thought maybe just respect," he answered. The son scoffed, his voice louder now. "This isn't some retirement party, Dad. It's a business. Investors don't care about sentimentality. They care about scale, speed, edge. What you had, it's dated, like floppy disks and phone books. The world moved on. You should too." He shoved his phone back into his pocket. "Don't make this weird. You were a great dad. You gave me a foundation. But foundations stay underground. You don't see them. That's their job." That sentence landed heavier than any shout could have. Foundations stay underground. He didn't reply, not right away. He just looked at the boy he had once held in his arms. The boy he taught how to ride a bike, how to tie his shoes, how to believe in blueprints no one else saw. And now, that boy stood in front of him in a tailored jacket, using his words like knives. "I'm not here for applause," the father finally said. "I'm here because I thought you'd remember, that's all." The son was already walking away. "Yeah, well," he muttered over his shoulder, "some things are better left in the past." The door closed behind him with a soft hiss. The father didn't move. For a long time he stood alone in the cold shade of a building built on his silence. And in that silence something hardened, not bitterness, but resolve. A week passed in a blur of investor calls and product roadmaps, until an unmarked envelope arrived on his desk, stamped with the crest of the district court. He recognized the weight of it before he even broke the seal. It was the quiet roar of consequences. He opened it with trembling fingers and unfolded the crisp pages inside. The heading read, "Notice of Allegation of Patent Infringement." Below, legal prose detailed specific claims, the modular neural processing architecture, the adaptive logic tree algorithm, the recursive pattern recognition protocol, all of which mirrored the very patents his father had filed in the late 90s. He read on. The plaintiff, his father, alleged unauthorized use of these patented technologies in the startup's core product. The letter offered two paths. Please contact our office within 14 days to discuss licensing terms, or a formal suit may be filed without further notice. He sank into his chair, heart pounding in his ears. The room seemed to tilt. He thought of every boardroom triumph, every investor's nod of approval, every keynote applause that validated his original work. Now it all cracked beneath him, threatening to collapse. Anger flared first, a hot pulse of betrayal. How dare he? But it was quickly eclipsed by something colder, the chill of recognition. His father hadn't raised a hand in anger. He had drawn a line, and in doing so he had exposed the foundation of an empire built on borrowed bricks. He stared at the document, the court seal gleaming like a judge's gavel, ready to fall. No longer could he dismiss his father as too old to understand. No longer could he pretend those ideas had sprung from nowhere. The letter was more than a legal notice. It was a call to reckon with truth. He closed his eyes, imagining his father back in that workshop, lamp burning late, the steady scratch of pen on paper, the whispered excitement of an idea taking form. He felt the weight of that toil pressing through time, each comma and diagram a testament, and now that history was standing before him in black ink, demanding its due. The silence stretched, heavy as verdict. He folded the pages carefully, then exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The fight ahead would be public, costly, uncomfortable. But it was a fight he could not avoid, because in challenging this notice, he would not only face the court, he would confront the man who taught him everything. His palm rested on the envelope's court seal as if bracing for impact. And for the first time in years, he felt the full weight of his father's legacy, not as a burden, but as an anchor he could no longer refuse to hold. The dinner table, once the place where birthdays were celebrated and holidays lived loud, had become a courtroom with no judge, just glares and accusations. She was the first to speak, the wife of his son, the woman who once called him Dad during holidays, who once asked for his help when the mortgage rate spiked. Now her voice cut across the room, brittle and shaking. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, not out of curiosity but condemnation. "You're tearing this family apart. Over what? Credit?" No one looked up. The clink of a spoon on a plate had stopped. A TV played quietly in the background, ignored. Someone's glass of wine tilted, forgotten in a half-lift. He said nothing. Her voice rose, louder now, sharp and pointed like a blade pressed to paper. "You could have talked to us. Privately. Instead, you sent lawyers?" Still, he stayed quiet. Then a small voice, unexpected, unprepared, came from the end of the table. His youngest grandson, no older than 10, eyes too wise for his age, too still for the chaos around him. "Grandpa, is it true? Was it your idea?" The room froze. The son's hand gripped his fork tighter. The daughter-in-law looked ready to explode again. But all eyes turned to the old man. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and carefully unfolded a single sheet of paper. Yellowed at the edges but preserved. A government seal, a reference number, a name written in clear ink. Walter E. Callahan. At the top, United States Patent and Trademark Office. The year, 1998. He held it up. Not high, not dramatic. Just enough for them to see. The boy leaned forward. His father didn't. The old man placed the paper gently beside his empty plate and met his grandson's eyes. No anger, no pride, just truth. Quiet and undeniable. "I built it," he finally said, voice like the earth, deep, steady, "and I gave it away." No response, no applause, no forgiveness, just silence. Because when betrayal is quiet, its echo is deafening. And in that moment, they all realized it wasn't a lawsuit. It was a line drawn between forgetting and remembering, and the cost of memory had just come due. The courtroom smelled like wood polish and old battles. Polite silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the scratch of pens and the occasional shuffle of legal documents. It wasn't a tabloid trial, not a media circus, just a father and a son, and a silence between them more powerful than any gavel. The son walked in first, flanked by 2 attorneys in dark tailored suits. He wore confidence like cologne, expensive, artificial, and sprayed a little too thick. There was even a faint smile on his face, a smirk that said, "This will be over soon." He didn't look at his father. The old man entered alone, slower, no suit, just his usual coat, the one with the inner pocket where he still kept handwritten notes. He walked with quiet dignity, like a man not there to win but to speak, to be heard, for once. He didn't bring a team, just a folder. Inside it, old sketches, time-stamped emails, drafts written late at night when the rest of the house slept, photos of whiteboards with his handwriting, letters from friends who once helped test early versions of the system, long before the son ever saw opportunity in it. The judge looked between them, the polished presentation and the worn leather of a life lived by principles. The son's attorney began, clear, precise, rehearsed. "This claim is not malicious," he said, "but mistaken. Our client is the sole innovator behind the product in question. Any resemblance to previous ideas is purely familial influence, not ownership. Familial influence, as if 30 years of design, calculation, testing, and patent navigation could be distilled into a fatherly chat over coffee." The old man didn't respond right away. He opened his folder slowly. His hands shook a little. Not from fear, but weight. The weight of carrying something alone for too long. And then he did what he never thought he'd need to do in his life. Defend his mind against his own blood. He didn't argue. He showed. One by one he laid the evidence out, like laying bricks on the foundation his son had chosen to walk away from. Not dramatic, not loud, but with the quiet force of truth that doesn't flinch. A silence filled the room as the dates were read, as his name was spoken, as the idea, the very ones pitched to investors months ago, echoed back at the son, now with government stamps and signatures older than the startup itself. The judge asked one question. "Did you ever claim joint development?" The son hesitated, just for a second, but it was long enough. The smile faded. The courtroom didn't gasp. It didn't need to, because the only sound that mattered was the quiet realization that this wasn't about royalties or credit. It was about erasure, and now, finally, the record was remembering. The courtroom was still, like the moment before a storm breaks. Only here the thunder came not from above, but from a sheet of paper held in the judge's hand. He adjusted his glasses, eyes narrowing as he began to read aloud. "Patent number 8-4-1-7-5-2, he said slowly, clearly. "Filed under the name Richard Alton." In the gallery, someone shifted in their seat. A cough, a whispered breath, and then nothing. The judge continued. "This document, dated June 17th, 1998, outlines the following proprietary framework: dynamic adaptive interface layers, nested behavioral algorithms, and predictive user modeling. Each term, once tossed around in investor decks and marketing videos, now fell like stones onto the courtroom floor. Not buzzwords, not trends, but proof. Proof that the bones of the empire the son had built, the one he called his, were already etched in legal ink before he had finished high school. The judge did not rush. He read page after page. The language was dry, technical, but what it carried wasn't. As each line matched the son's innovative breakthrough, a subtle shift happened in the room, a turning of the tide. On the screen behind the judge, a scan of the original patent flickered to life. Scanned signature, diagrams with fine black lines, annotations in blue ink, handwritten notes that matched the father's quiet demeanor, precise, intentional, patient. In the back row, an investor's jaw clenched. The son, once seated with effortless poise, now leaned forward. His fingers tapped the table, anxious, confused, angry maybe, though not at the judge, not even at his father. At the mirror now being held up to his own success. He had called it innovation, reinvention, disruption. But what the courtroom now understood, what the judge methodically, relentlessly made clear, was that this had never been about invention. It was about inheritance, the kind not passed down in money or mansions, but in ideas, in sacrifice, in lonely nights spent refining the work, not for applause, but for progress. No one spoke as the judge laid the final paper down. His eyes lifted. For a moment he didn't say a word. The silence itself felt like a verdict, and in that silence the son finally looked at his father, not as an old man out of touch, but as the mind he had tried to outgrow and failed to outrun. The judge's question hung in the air like a drawn breath no one dared release. Did you know the origin of these ideas? In that instant, the son's posture shifted, shoulders tightening, head tilting down, hands gripping the edge of the table. His mouth opened as if to answer, but no words came. It was the clearest admission of all, the silence of someone caught between ambition and truth. His attorney cleared his throat, shuffling papers as if to distract from the void where a response should have been. But legal maneuvering could not mask what everyone felt. The fracture of integrity laid bare. The room seemed to contract. The air felt colder, heavier. Those who came to witness a corporate triumph now sensed the unraveling of a myth. Witnesses, once ready to nod in approval, sat forward, curiosity sharpening into something more urgent. At the back of the room, a key investor, a man who had already committed millions, rose silently from his chair. His face was unreadable for a moment, then settled into quiet resolve. Without a glance toward the son or the judge, he crossed to the door and stepped outside. The soft click echoed through the chamber, marking a departure not just of a person but of faith. Down on the floor, reporters scribbled frantically, cameras angled for the inevitable fallout. But the real story was being told, not in headlines, but in the absence of applause, in the hollow space where ambition eclipsed honesty. The judge leaned back, gazed steady on the son. "No further questions?" he asked. His voice was gentle, almost compassionate for the son's predicament, yet firm, reminding everyone that silence can speak louder than any brief. No one spoke. The son looked up then, meeting his father's eyes for the first time in the trial. In that gaze was every moment he dismissed his father, every hurried "not now," and every borrowed idea presented as his own. He saw not just the man before him, but the legacy he tried to overwrite. And as the courtroom held its breath, the true cost became clear. That which cannot be spoken away, truth, always finds its voice, even through the loudest silence. The verdict was not just words spoken into the room. It was a reckoning. The judge's voice, calm yet resolute, delivered the decision like a stone into still water. "This court finds," he said, glancing at the documents in front of him, "that the technology in question belongs to the plaintiff, Mr. Alton Sr. The patents are valid, the timeline indisputable, and the evidence overwhelming." Silence. Not a murmur. Not even a cough. Just the weight of truth settling into the wood-paneled walls like dust that would never be shaken off again. The judge continued. "Furthermore, the defendant is hereby ordered to pay damages for unauthorized use of said intellectual property. A financial penalty will be determined in accordance with the estimated valuation of the infringed assets. Additionally, due to the foundational role these innovations played in the establishment and funding of Alton Technologies, a percentage of company equity is to be transferred to the rightful originator." Then the final sentence. "This court recognizes Mr. Alton Sr. as the intellectual and legal founder of the core system currently powering the company." No one applauded. No one smiled. Not even the father. Because this wasn't triumph. Not in the way people imagine victory. It was a quiet correction of something that should never have needed courtrooms and judges to be acknowledged. The son's face was unreadable, pale but not defiant. There was no outburst, no slamming of fists or tearful apology, just stillness. A man unraveling in real time, not because he lost money, but because he lost something far more irreplaceable: trust, respect, and the simple, immeasurable pride of having done right by the person who once held him as a child, whispered dreams in his ear, and planted in him the very seeds of thought that he later claimed as his own. The father didn't look at him, not out of cruelty, but because he had already looked too long, waited too long, hoped too long for the recognition that should have come at a dinner table, not in a courtroom. He gathered his folder, papers carefully placed back in order, not a crease bent, like the man himself. Bruised, maybe, but never broken. As he stood, the bailiff nodded to him. The judge did too. And behind them, in the gallery, a few heads lowered in quiet apology. not because they had wronged him directly, but because they had once believed the myth that age meant irrelevance. But now the record was clear. He wasn't a relic. He was the foundation. It appeared 3 weeks after the trial, a magazine cover that most people would have overlooked at the newsstand, except for the title in bold serif, laid over a quiet photo that said more than any headline ever could. The old man they forgot. How a 90s patent rewrote a billion-dollar story. He didn't even know about the article until a nurse at the community center gently placed it on the table beside his coffee cup. "Thought you might want to keep this one," she said with a smile, already moving on before he could answer. He picked it up with steady, work-worn fingers. And there he was. Not in a polished corporate portrait, not behind a podium, not holding awards. Just himself, in his small, cluttered workshop, a younger version of him years ago, leaning over a desk with a pencil behind his ear and diagrams spread across the surface. A mug of cold coffee off to the side, the edge of a transistor board under his elbow, and a look on his face, focused, humble, unbothered by time. That's where it had started. Not in boardrooms, not in pitch decks or funding rounds. In that garage with his own hands and the belief that ideas were born not for ego, but for function, for people. The article wasn't sensational. It was quiet, respectful. It spoke not only of the legal battle, but of the way memory can fail a man while he's still breathing. It quoted industry leaders now admitting the platform's code mirrored the original patents, almost line for line. It mentioned how investors had pulled out of the Sun's company, not in vengeance, but because, as one said, if he can forget where he came from, how can we trust where he's going? And then came a paragraph that made him pause. Walter Alton Sr. never demanded attention, never chased legacy, but history, it turns out, has a habit of circling back to those who built quietly. And it remembers, not the names that shouted the loudest, but the hands that built the silence. He sat with that line for a long time, not out of pride, but because finally, something outside the courtroom saw what he had always known, that the work of his life had not vanished. It had simply been buried under noise, and now, piece by piece, it was surfacing again. He folded the magazine carefully, not to preserve it, but out of habit, the same way he used to fold every blueprint when he finished it, as if even memory deserved precision. He didn't frame it, didn't hang it. He just slipped it into a drawer beneath a stack of old notebooks, where ideas still lived in ink and margin scribbles, not because he needed proof, but because sometimes public memory catches up, and when it does so in full color. He didn't return with headlines. There was no camera waiting at the doorstep, no neighbors whispering over fences, just the sound of gravel under his shoes and the familiar click of his front door unlocking. The home hadn't changed, still smelled faintly of oil, old wood, and coffee, still carried the echo of years spent sketching dreams that for a long time no one believed in but him. He hung up his coat, let the silence settle again. Then he noticed it, the envelope on the table. No stamp, just his name written in neat, uneven lines. A boy's handwriting, but no longer childish. Careful, nervous, honest. He opened it. Inside, a single sentence. "Grandpa, can I come hear the story from the beginning? I want to understand it on my own." He sat down slowly, the letter in one hand, the other resting over his heart. Not out of weakness, but out of weight, the kind of weight only love can carry when it returns after being lost. He thought back to the courtroom, to the magazine, to the silence of family dinners where no one looked him in the eye. He remembered birthdays missed, conversations dismissed, the ache of invisibility in a home built on his shoulders, and yet this one line from a boy trying to see the man behind the myths, it cut deeper than any judge's gavel, any journalist's praise, because this was not public memory. This was personal memory, the beginning of repair. That night, he pulled the oldest box from his closet. It smelled like sawdust and solder. Inside were yellowed sketches, letters dated 1996, photos of machines no longer built, notes he once wrote to himself just to stay motivated. He laid them gently on the table, one by one, like a trail back through time. He made 2 mugs of cocoa, set one aside for the boy. He didn't know if his grandson would come that night or the next, but for the first time in years he felt ready, not to teach, not to prove, but simply to be heard. And maybe, just maybe, that would be the greatest invention of all. Not what he built, but who finally came to listen. The workbench hadn't seen this kind of life in years. The sun filtered in through the dusty garage window, catching in the curls of sawdust that danced midair. The old lamp buzzed faintly overhead, and every drawer creaked like a voice waking after silence. The prototype, or what was left of it, sat quietly beneath a stained canvas, the way forgotten treasures do, waiting not for applause, but for touch. He lifted the cover. The boy, his grandson, leaned in, eyes wide, not at the machine itself, which looked almost silly compared to today's slick devices, but at the sketches pinned to the corkboard behind it, scribbled in pencil, annotated in ink, dated, corrected, smudged by calloused fingers. Real. He didn't ask about the money, didn't ask how much it would have earned if the patent had been exploited sooner. Instead, he asked, "How did you come up with it?" The old man paused. Then he picked up a rusted coil and said quietly, "By staying up when the world slept, by listening to what wasn't said, by fixing what everyone else called broken." And so they worked, not with urgency, but with care. Each part they cleaned carried memory, the whir of the first working wheel, the burn from a slipped soldering iron, the joy of the first trial run when it all finally clicked together. The boy laughed once when a spring popped out, and his grandfather smiled, not because of the mistake, but because it wasn't followed by frustration or blame, just curiosity. They didn't speak much that day. The wires, bolts, and blueprints said enough. By evening, the prototype stood again, awkward, imperfect, but upright, as if defying time itself. The boy ran his hand across the edge and whispered, "So this is what building looks like." His grandfather didn't respond right away. He just looked at him, really looked, and saw not the arrogance of entitlement, but the quiet birth of respect. In that moment, it wasn't about the past or the court or what was owed. It was about something more powerful than ownership, understanding. They stood there together in the fading light, surrounded by fragments of invention, pieces of memory, and the slow, steady stitching of a bond once torn. Not by fate, but by forgetting. Now finally remembering had begun. The day he signed the final document, the courtroom was empty. The judge who had presided over the case long ago sat in his modest chambers, now retired and free of robes, waiting with a simple bouquet of wildflowers, bluebells and daisies, from the judge's own garden. He hadn't come for headlines or ceremony. He had come because some victories are meant for the heart, not the press. The father stood before the judge's polished wood desk, the same desk that once ruled on his fate. Now it held only memories and the weight of new beginnings. He wore a quiet suit, nothing sharp or formal, just as he preferred in the workshop where real work was done. In his hand, the final assignment of rights, a single sheet of vellum that transferred every last patent, every spark of ingenuity, to an educational center for young engineers, a place where dreams would be tested under bright lights and curious eyes, not left to gather dust in safes or serve as weapons in boardroom battles. He had declined his share of the company without hesitation, not out of anger, but out of hope. He imagined classrooms filled with the hum of soldering irons and the glow of half-assembled prototypes. He pictured mentors guiding hands that trembled at first, helping them steady circuits and raise their voices in discovery. He knew that the real value of an idea wasn't in the balance sheet. It was in the moment when a student's face lit up as a motor spun for the first time, proving that curiosity still had power in a world hungry for buzzwords. The judge, his hair silver now, offered a warm smile. "You've done more than win a case," he said softly. "You've turned conflict into opportunity." There was no need to mention the son's company or the financial award. That had already been settled. Today was about something beyond contracts, When the judge thanked him for restoring justice, the old man shook his head. "No, Your Honor," he replied, voice steady but gentle. "I wasn't too old to understand after all. I was just too modest to remind the world that I had built the foundation." They stood together in the waning afternoon light. The weight of years and battles settled into a shared understanding that true legacy isn't measured in shares or patents. It's measured in what you leave behind in the hands you guide, in the minds you ignite, and in the quiet confidence of a next generation empowered to build, unafraid to innovate and unbound by the fear of erasure. As he walked out of the chambers, the old man didn't look back. He carried only a small satchel with blueprints for the new workshop he'd planned to visit, a place where young engineers already waited to learn, to fail, and to rise again. The flowers lay forgotten on the desk, but their promise lingered, that growth, like justice, begins when someone dares to give more than they take, and when a name whispered in a courtroom becomes a spark in 1,000 hearts. And in that echo, his real legacy lived on.